Now, when Jake Sullivan visited China, it probably wasn't sincere. The idea was to prevent an escalation and to ensure relations don't get any worse. Well, the meeting definitely didn't go as planned. He wanted the Chinese to turn against Russia, but that didn't work. And to make things worse, he doubled down on punishing Chinese technology. He has vowed that the semiconductor curbs on Beijing are not going away. In fact, it's only going to escalate from here to here. For over 5 years, China has been stockpiling a ton of semiconductor equipment, the gear needed to make the chips. They're spending money like crazy to get the chip makers now before the G7 shuts everything down. Just in 2024, from January to July, Beijing spent $26 billion to get the equipment. It's coming from Japan, the Netherlands, and even from US companies. Now, Sullivan sees these and he has a bright idea to punish China. Not only is he going to cut away avenues for China to buy, he wants to target the existing machines themselves. The strategy is to deny China of servicing their lithography machines and let them age out over time, so that the return goes down and China can't make any progress on new advanced chips. It's like allowing your car to age without either replacing it or getting a mechanic to service it. Sooner or later, it will break down. In other words, the US wants China's stockpile of chip makers to become obsolete over time. Now, this is frightening, but a big semiconductor giant is about to join the US to punish China. ASML, the Dutch chipmaker, plans to stop repairing and maintaining China's semiconductor equipment. Now, this has happened before. The company has bought the most advanced machines to China already, but they might be taking things to the next level. This is damaging at least in the short term. Companies like Huawei and SMIC, they rely on lithography machines from ASML, and according to Bloomberg, there's a strong chance of the curbs happening. Once again, we are seeing extreme pressure from the US, and their allies are kind of willing to destroy their own economies for Washington. Countries like Japan and the Netherlands, they must understand the big agenda here. This is the grand plan of the US when it comes to chips.
One company in Taiwan supplies us the vast majority of the most sophisticated chips we need. If that doesn't get your attention, I don't know what will. That is downright scary. It's vulnerable. It's a risk to our national security. It's a risk to our ability to lead with strength in the world. And there is a solution. Make more chips in America, reshore that, and invest in domestic production. America still leads the world in design of chips, still leads the world in software and equipment, but we have to get back into the business of making this stuff in America.
Raimondo basically gave away the game plan. She wants the manufacturing of chips, the entire semiconductor industry, to return to the US. And if some eggs have to break to make it happen, well, it's just collateral damage. Companies like ASML in the Netherlands and Tokyo Electron in Japan, they depend on China for the bulk of their revenue, and this won't end well for them. It might be a ban on servicing the machines today, but there could be a complete shutdown of sales tomorrow. Chinese sales accounts for over 2 billion euros in Q2 this year for ASML, and that's nearly 50% of their entire bottom line. Any company in the world that loses half of their revenue will be in serious trouble. For China, they can still get their chip making gear elsewhere. Even if you cut away all of America's allies, China still has access to other markets. 36% of their imports last year were from other countries, especially those in Southeast Asia. In fact, we could see third-party countries buy the gear from Japan or the Netherlands and then turn around and ship it to China next. It's a kind of proxy trading. And this kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? Just like how Russian oil today is still flowing to the G7 countries. The oil enters India, it is processed and then shipped to Europe. So there's always a workaround to all these sanctions. The problem with whacking China is the risk of counter retaliation. It's critical we realize that Beijing's biggest trump card is their supply chains and their economic war chest. They can ramp up the heat on the West, they just need to tighten the supply of critical minerals for the manufacturing of semiconductors and all the chip makers. Gallium, germanium, and graphite. These are critical components for chip production, and China has begun restricting exports since August last year. If this evolves into a complete ban, chip companies in the US, Europe, and Japan will suffer. If Beijing decides to weaponize their supply chain, this will be a disaster for the G7 countries. Their dominance of these critical minerals is incredible. Nearly 100% of gallium production is Chinese. For germanium, it's around 68%. Fluorspar is essential output for making hydrogen fluoride, which is necessary for manufacturing chips, while the majority belongs to China as well. Washington can tighten the screws, but so can China. This will only result in a tit for tat restriction war that will drive chip prices up for the world. This isn't a win for the West, it will just send their costs to the moon. Sooner or later, China will bridge the technology gap. It might take them 2 years, 5 years, or maybe even a decade. But once they do, the end game is pretty clear. They will achieve economies of scale faster than the West because of their supply chain efficiency. Plus, they also have cheap discounted energy from Russia, cheap gas, so they can drop prices to the rest of the world. The West might be forced to ban Chinese chips like what we are doing to EVs today. Then we'll have countries in the BRICS, in the global south, in Asia buying affordable chips, while the G7 will be cursed with expensive semiconductors. Now, it's true that the West has a tech advantage against China. We are talking about the most advanced cutting edge chips, the stuff companies like Nvidia produce. Chinese companies are around 5 years behind the global leaders, but this gap will erode over time, and this is where we must discuss the big financial war chest Beijing has amassed. The country is the world's biggest trading partner, and every single month, they have a trade surplus of over $100 billion. They are stockpiling slightly over $1 trillion of hard currency in just 1 year. And because China has a top down approach to basically everything, the government can channel these funds to whatever industry they want to subsidize. This is a chart of the biggest semiconductor investors in the world, and if we want to be honest, all of them get government subsidies one way or another. China's Huawei has the biggest amount of R&D budget in 2023 at over 20 billion euros. Their intensity of research is also within the top 5 companies in the world, just behind Intel and AMD. China also produces more STEM graduates a year than all the Western countries combined, so there's no lack of brain power here. And that's what happens when you encourage a generation of people to study what feels good to them, like underwater basket weaving. Just in 2020, China produced 3.5 million STEM graduates, with India in second place. The US produces just 820,000 graduates, so the advantage is at least 4 times higher for Beijing. It's going to boil down to how much money the government is willing to invest in the sector. The more they throw at the problem, the sooner they will reach parity with the US and maybe even Taiwan down the road. The tech restrictions will definitely delay advancement, but not forever. This is perhaps the most important chart today, is the funding allocated for semiconductors around the world. And this shows us the commitment each country has to support their industries. Because at the end of the day, we have said it many times, this is just one big subsidy war. The US has $75 billion from their CHIPS Act. The EU has subsidies of $46 billion. Taiwan comes in at $16 billion, and Japan has around $25 billion in government support. You have to combine all that to even surpass China. Beijing has planned an incredible war chest of $142 billion. The more the West tightens the screws, the bigger the subsidies China will throw at a problem. Now, let's not forget there's still a big property issue today, and domestic Chinese consumption is weak, so that needs support as well. But once that crisis is settled, we can be sure financial support will be diverted to the semiconductor industry. The West has to realize how it treats China today could really affect how Beijing treats them tomorrow. And you can call it what you want, karma, cause and effect, or the cycle of life, it really doesn't matter. We are stuck on this endless cycle of retaliation. And here's one example of how China can tighten their own screws on Western economies. The government is now asking importers to halt the purchase of grain, to stop the import of foreign produce, to support their local farmers. But pay attention to this part. They want to ease domestic stockpiles. In other words, China doesn't want to be reliant on foreign producers. Look at it from their point of view. You saw the Western financial system being used against Russia. $300 billion in assets were confiscated. Now you yourself, you're facing a lot of restrictions and your banking system is under threat every single day. Now, what is more important than technology and your national reserves? It's your country's food supply. China is the biggest consumer of food in the world. Their grain consumption is at the top spot. In 2019, Beijing's grain imports just shot to the roof. It went from 18 billion tons of barley, corn, and sorghum to over 40 million tons in just a few years. Now, if you're a grain producer, you can read this as China is a growing customer, and it makes sense to sell more to the Chinese market. It is exploding higher after all. But Beijing probably sees this in another light. Growing imports means a growing vulnerability. It's a weakness that can be weaponized against them. You need to grow your own food and be more self sufficient. But China boosting their own domestic production is going to hurt Western farmers the most. Take Canada, for example. They are a big exporter of wheat to the Chinese market. However, exports across the board has been mostly falling over the past year. Wheat is down by 300,000 tons. Barley exports collapsed by over double that amount, 700,000 tons down. In total, grains to China fell by over 40% in that period versus a year back. Notice how the fall began as tensions with the G7 ramped up. China is going to start reducing their imports of Western grain because it's simply a point of vulnerability. The US targets Chinese EVs, their solar panels, and even TikTok over national security grounds, right? Well, this is likely Beijing's own retaliation on the same basis of national security as well. Back in April, they already demonstrated this. China cancelled around a million tons of wheat shipments from Australia and the US. And this came out of the blue, out of nowhere, and basically crashed the wheat prices. Sure, part of it is to negotiate better prices, but it's also a warning to the West from the biggest food consumer in the world. So this decoupling is only going to get worse. The West might be moving to cut away China's access to technology to hinder their progress, but the same game will be played on them, and food is already a battleground. The Chinese market imported over $140 billion worth of food last year. This number continues to dwindle down. The government is going to push for more self sufficiency. So there are going to be winners and losers. If Beijing imports less Western grain, who is winning? The food has to come from elsewhere. It's going to be the BRICS countries, especially Russia, who wins big. They are selling more grain to the Chinese. In the first 3 quarters of last year, Russia exported 3.5 million tons of grain, and that's 50% more than the 2 million tons sold the previous year. And Putin's production is only going to grow. There are a ton of Chinese farmers resettling in the Russian Far East, and they are working the land, so exports from Russia are more secure than those from the West. And this tells us how the world is shifting towards how things are evolving, decoupling between economic blocs. There's really no going back after this. The big trigger was the war 2 years back. At that point of time, both the West and China realized they need to reshore critical industries and break away from each other. And this will mean a world of more economic shocks. And for you and me, this will only result in higher inflation. But let me know what you think. Is the Netherlands making a big mistake? And how will China hit back? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.